Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Endowment for Middle East Truth special Yom HaShoah webinar featuring Holocaust historian Dr. Rafael Medoff to help us put into perspective recent events in the context of Holocaust Remembrance Day and the lessons that the Jewish people and the global population more generally seem not to have learned or perhaps have quickly forgotten in these short 76 years since Israel's founding. I want to thank all of you for joining, and we greatly appreciate your support of the important work that we do at Emmett. These are very challenging times for Israel and the global Jewish population, which is facing anti-Semitism not seen since Nazi Germany, and we're working tirelessly to do our part in this existential battle. I'm proud to share that the House of Representatives just passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that we have been working on for years, and hopefully it will pass the Senate and be signed into law as Jewish students desperately need the protection that it provides. We couldn't do our work without you, so please consider sponsoring a webinar or going to our website and making a contribution. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for future viewing. Please share it with friends and families. If you have any questions for Dr. Medoff, please put them in the Q&A queue at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try and get to as many as possible later in the program. Please limit your submissions to questions only. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Rafael Medoff, the founding director of the David S. Weinman Institute for Holocaust Studies based in Washington, D.C., which focuses on America's response to Nazism and the Holocaust. He is the author of more than 20 books about the Holocaust, Zionism, and American Jewish history, and has contributed to the Encyclopedia Judaica and many other reference volumes. He has also taught Jewish history at Ohio State University, Purchase College of the State University of New York, and elsewhere. He also has a brand new book out entitled Whistleblowers, Four Who Fought to Expose the Holocaust to America. And I can share that he is unbelievably prolific, and I encourage everybody to please follow Dr. Medoff's work, his articles that he writes quite often. Welcome, Dr. Medoff. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, and thanks to Emmett's founder and director, Sarah Stern, for inviting me today.
Before we get into what's happening on our college campuses, I want to discuss the raging anti-Semitism that's been growing for perhaps 2 decades, not just in academia, but in the media, in politics, on the left, in Islam, on our streets. It's in cities across Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and of course, the US. For those of us in this space, we sadly were not surprised at what we're now seeing unleashed, but it's no less distressing. It seems to me that many Jews have simply not been paying attention because today's anti-Semitism is now in the form of anti-Zionism, and Israel has never been a priority for American Jews, certainly not as a voting issue in any event. And so the vast majority of Americans, and I think certainly American Jews, have been shocked. Can you discuss this new anti-Semitism and how it appears from your perspective as a historian of the Holocaust? Is it really just good old-fashioned anti-Semitism wrapped in a different clothing, but motivated by the same animus towards Jewish people? And more importantly, our diaspora Jews, and not just in the US, but London's a mess and other cities where Jews reside, are we repeating the apathy, naivete, and assimilation mistakes that European Jews made in the lead up to the Shoah?
Well, anti-Semitism in the Arab world, to begin with, hasn't changed at all. And for those who follow the expert translations that are provided by groups like Palestinian Media Watch and Memory, you know that the same anti-Jewish stereotypes and hateful remarks and Holocaust denial that we're seeing today in Palestinian, Jordanian, Syrian, and other Arab newspapers, television, and radio has been going on, for many, many decades. So in that sense, in that part of the world, it's nothing new. What's new and especially frightening to many American Jews is the eruption of extreme anti-Israel and often anti-Semitic sentiment in the Western world, especially here in the United States. We're not accustomed to these levels of raw hatred in a society which we have generally perceived as being rational and civilized and modern. And so we don't expect this kind of outpouring of almost insane anti-Jewish hatred. Now, of course, anti-Semitism in America is not new. It seems to go through different phases. Historians previously regarded the 1930s and early 1940s as the peak of anti-Semitism in America. So in some cases, it depends how you measure it. If you look at public opinion polls back in the 30s and 40s, then we see very high levels of positive responses to questions about whether Jews are cheap, whether Jews are clannish, whether Jews can be trusted, and that sort of thing. So measured by those polls, for a long time, it seemed as if that was the era of peak anti-Semitism in the United States. And after World War II, after America had gone through its war against Nazi Germany, and Nazism was discredited, and American society was much more welcoming and open, it seemed that anti-Semitism had reached an all-time low in the 1950s and into the 1960s. But remarkably, anti-Semitism seems to find all new ways to reemerge, sometimes from different sources. Up until relatively recently, the conventional wisdom was that most anti-Semitism in modern America comes from the far right. And of course, white supremacists are notoriously anti-Semitic, and hate groups like the old Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazi groups were a noisy, if small, force on the American scene. But clearly, something has shifted very significantly. The old white supremacist groups are obviously in retreat. They're very small in number. And in fact, if you look at the hate group monitoring, even by left of center groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, according to their count, the largest anti-Semitic hate group in the United States is Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam, obviously not a white supremacist or left-wing source. Today, the vast bulk of the anti-Jewish hatred that we're witnessing, whether in rhetoric or in physical attacks or in vandalism, such as the painting of swastikas, etc., is clearly coming from what we would call the political far left. So this is something new, and it's disconcerting. But I suppose what's especially disconcerting is that the anti-Semitism of the far left is being treated by significant elements in the Democratic Party in a way very different from how they reacted to and we continue to react to anti-Semitism from the far right. That's very disturbing, because in order for America to remain a civil, rational, peaceful society where different ethnic groups coexist, all hatred, anti-Semitism, other forms of racism, all of it needs to be marginalized. It all has to be kept on the edges of society. So for a mainstream political party to tolerate some forms of anti-Semitism poses a very frightening new prospect for the overall integrity of American political culture. How can you trust America's institutions? How can you have faith in the longevity of American democracy if one of the two major political parties refuses to clearly, unequivocally, and consistently condemn, and not only condemn, but actually combat anti-Semitism? So that's the frightening new aspect. Now, there is, of course, another significant and ironic aspect to the new anti-Semitism in America, and that's the fact that so much of it is centered on college campuses. Many of us have, for a long time, believed, somewhat naively, that education can help stamp out bigotry and anti-Semitism. But the very fact that there's so much anti-Jewish hatred on college campuses of all places, and in the most prestigious Ivy League institutions like Harvard and Yale, and Columbia and Cornell, shatters that illusion that we can put our trust in higher education, that as people become more educated, they become more rational, more reasonable, and less bigoted. We're not seeing that. We're actually seeing quite the opposite, that young men and women who have gone through years of university training, and in many cases are already graduate students on their way to become PhDs, intellectual leaders of America in the years ahead, instead are embracing wild anti-Israel and anti-Jewish falsehoods, things that are completely irrational and vicious, and run contrary to every American value.
Well, they certainly are hiding behind claims that they're just criticizing the Jewish homeland as opposed to hating Jews, which is, I think, has allowed it to get to the point where it has. And I'm going to ask you more about the campuses, but first I just wanted to ask you, over the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement proliferate. International demonization of Israel has ratcheted up at the UN, it's in the EU, and as I said, Latin America. And I'm glad you brought up the US Congress. And while we just discussed how you gave us some background on this new state of anti-Semitism, but it is being couched in anti-Zionism. The existence of the state of Israel is the tool for Jew haters to espouse their venom, and allows them to claim that they're not really anti-Semitic. And we're seeing it, as I said, at the UN. You've got whole countries. South Africa brought charges against Israel at the International Court of Justice. The country, Colombia, just cut all diplomatic relations with Israel. Do you believe that there are really that many Jew haters in the world? Are their voices just more, powerful and loud, or is this disdain for the state of Israel something that really is pervasive as it seems it is? Is it I guess my bottom line question is it as pervasive as it seems it is?
It's probably even worse than how it seems, and it's certainly a lot louder than it's ever been. When I say it's probably worse than it seems, I'm referring to the fact that, let's say if you take a public opinion poll and you ask average American questions about how do you feel about Jews or blacks or Latinos or almost any minority group, there are a number of people who will not answer that question completely honestly, because they know that openly embracing or explicitly embracing any kind of racism is generally frowned upon in American society. So you have to take into consideration that even the numbers that we hear officially of people who acknowledge that they think Jews are this or that, the actual number of people who harbor such sentiments is probably much larger than it seems. The same is true for anti-Semitic incidents. The vandalism and the harassment and the other kinds of attacks that are monitored by groups that keep track of anti-Semitism. The number of incidents that we hear about, which has been increasing rapidly in recent weeks, months, and years, that number is far below the actual number of anti-Semitic incidents that take place in America every year, because not everybody reports them. Many people will experience anti-Semitic harassment or see a swastika drawn on a wall somewhere, and choose not to call the police or not to call a major Jewish organization that tallies such incidents. So there's no doubt that the level of anti-Semitism and the intensity of anti-Semitism in America today is far worse than we can even deduce from official statistics. As for the question of anti-Semitism that is wrapped in the guise of anti-Zionism, well, that was a rhetorical device that people who hate Jews used for many years, somewhat effectively, but which today has become transparently dishonest, which is to say that really the gloves have come off, and the rhetoric that we see in the signs and speeches of these pro-Hamas student extremists crosses into anti-Semitism again and again and again. Just the other day, there was a widely circulated photograph of a pro-Hamas student radical at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., holding up a placard calling for the final solution. Now, nobody just comes up with the term final solution by chance or by accident. Obviously, the person who created that sign knew what she was referring to. And we all know what she was referring to: the mass murder of millions of Jews. So to, in effect, call for another final solution, to invoke that Nazi term, crosses a line. That's not just saying that she disagrees with this or that Israeli policy. Calling for the mass murder of Jews is anti-Semitism. It's not merely anti-Zionism. And I would add to that the following thought. Calling for the destruction of Israel after October 7th does mean something different and something important than it did probably on October 6th. Now, even on October 6th, I would have said that calling for the destruction of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism. And it wouldn't just be me saying it. The 33 countries that belong to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the ones who crafted the important, now famous definition of anti-Semitism, have always regarded calling for Israel's destruction as anti-Semitism. But the point is to say from the river to the sea, Palestine must replace Israel. After October 7th is to say that what happened on October 7th, the mass murder, the tortures, the gang rapes, the beheadings, that is what should be done to millions of Jews in Israel. Now, by way of comparison, imagine if student protesters from some white supremacist group were saying that we're calling for, African Americans to be lynched. It would, of course, be regarded as racism. It's not just a matter of saying, well, they only want to kill blacks who are in America. They don't want to kill all blacks around the world. So maybe it's not really racist. No, it is racist, because calling for the mass murder of people based on their race or ethnicity or religion is in fact bigotry. So saying that everything from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, that is the state of Israel, should be destroyed in the wake of October 7th is saying that what happened on October 7th should be applied to all of that area. Or to cite a second very common slogan chanted and written on signs at these campus rallies, to call for an intifada is to invoke a very specific and very recent historical term, much more recent than final solution. The intifadas, the two periods of mass Palestinian Arab violence against Israel in the early 2000s, consisted of hundreds of suicide bombings, thousands of stabbings and attempts to burn Jews to death, machine gun massacres of participants in a Passover Seder. Every horrible, violent kind of terrorist attack you could imagine is part of either the first intifada or the second intifada. So when a graduate student on the campus of Columbia University yells "Intifada Revolution" or holds up a banner that says "Globalize the Intifada," what they are saying in plain English is millions of Jews in Israel and probably elsewhere, but certainly in Israel, millions of Israeli Jews should again have their buses blown up, should have their religious events assaulted with machine gun attacks. They should be burned to death in Molotov cocktails. They should be stoned to death in rock throwing attacks. They should be shot by snipers and stabbed by knifers. They're calling for something very specific. They're not calling for two states. If all these radical students were marching around with signs that said, "We want a Palestinian state in a small part of that contested territory," well, I think a lot of people would conclude that it's not anti-Semitic. But that's not at all what they're doing. In fact, they are invoking and utilizing the most extreme anti-Jewish slogans possible. Their slogans call for the mass murder of millions of Jews. How could that not be anti-Semitism? The answer is it can't be. It is anti-Semitism. It's as plain as day. And that's why today we find that there is a widespread acknowledgement on both sides of the political aisle that anti-Semitism is increasing significantly. Now, there's an important division between Democrats and Republicans as what should be done about it. But just this week, President Biden, in his speech to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, said there has been a frightening surge in anti-Semitism. Now, some in his camp don't want to explicitly acknowledge that slogans like "from the river to the sea" are anti-Semitic, but they too are acknowledging there is a surge of anti-Semitism. And since there are no mass rallies of the Ku Klux Klan or white supremacist neo-Nazi groups these days, then we all are aware and recognizing that there is a surge of anti-Semitism from the political left in the most renowned bastions of the political left, and that is America's college campuses.
So would you compare what's going on college campuses and the student protesters to perhaps the brown shirts who forced Jews off of German campuses in the lead up to the Holocaust? I mean, I think, one difference is that the brown shirts were supported by the German government, whereas the current variety of campus terrorists are organized and funded by nefarious individuals and organizations like George Soros and his Open Society, Tides, Rockefeller Fund. Uh, uh, so is there a meaningful differentiation given that the result is the same? Jews are being forced off of campuses?
One of the main reasons we study the Holocaust today, and we look closely at that entire period of the 1930s and 1940s, is in order to learn the lessons of that period so that the mistakes of those years will not be repeated. There are similarities and there are differences. There have to be. No two historical circumstances are ever identical. But there are important points of comparison. There are troubling parallels between what's happening today and what took place in the 1930s. Now, on American college campuses in the 1930s, there were a number of episodes which are worth recalling. They're not identical, but they're noteworthy. So, by way of example, at George Washington University in the 1930s, officials of the embassy of Nazi Germany were repeatedly welcomed to campus. They spoke on campus. Nobody protested. Nobody marched. Nobody denounced them. Actual Nazis were welcomed to campus. It's ironic to have students today with signs invoking the Nazi slogan, final solution, at George Washington University, when on their own campus, actual Nazis really were welcomed in the 30s. Moreover, the George Washington University administration maintained friendly relations with Nazi-controlled universities. They had a student exchange program where George Washington students were sent to the University of Munich in the 1930s for a year abroad. The University of Munich, where they had a completely Nazified curriculum, where Jewish faculty had been purged, where there were mass book burnings, completely Nazi-controlled institutions, and George Washington sent its students there. But they weren't the only ones. Columbia had such friendly relations with Nazi Germany. So did Harvard. So did other Ivy League institutions. So there was a real pattern. Now, I just mentioned that when Nazi representatives came to the George Washington campus in the 30s, nobody protested. Ironically, there was a somewhat different reception when the Nazi ambassador to Washington, Hans Luther, was invited to Columbia in 1933. Hundreds of students actually did protest. Most students did not, but to the credit of at least a minority of Columbia students, they held repeated protest rallies against Nazis coming to their campus and against their administration having friendly relations with Nazi Germany. In fact, the leader of those student protests at Columbia, Robert Burke, was permanently expelled from Columbia as punishment for having led peaceful, nonviolent rallies opposing Columbia's policy. And I should just add here that although it would be a very small step, it's high time that Columbia posthumously award a degree to Robert Burke and publicly acknowledge that it was wrong to silence the anti-Nazi voices in the 1930s. But apologies by Columbia or other universities for their pro-Nazi actions in the 30s would not address the problem today. That is the problem of their own students cheering on the Nazis of the 21st century. That is the Hamas mass murderers and gang rapists whom Israel is now trying to combat. So we have quite a turn of the tables here where you have a minority, clearly, but a very noisy minority of students at elite American universities openly cheering for those whom we know committed incredible, horrific atrocities on October 7th, and also committed many atrocities long before October 7th. But in the wake of the gang rapes and the mass murders and tortures, nonetheless, these supposedly liberal-minded progressive students are out there marching in support of Hamas, a terrorist group and a regime in Gaza, which really represents every value that liberal-minded Americans should oppose. I mean, the society that Hamas governed in Gaza until the recent war began was a fascist dictatorship where there were no civil rights, there was no free speech, where women were abused with impunity, and which in every way represented exactly the opposite of liberal democratic American values. And yet here we have educated students at prestigious universities marching in support of that fascist terrorist group, and demanding that Israel cease firing at these fascists and allow Hamas to resume control of Gaza and reinstate this incredible fascist terrorist dictatorship. So yes, we are living through a period of rich and very disappointing irony, a period in which many of us would not have expected, and yet in some ways it's almost a logical fruit of what's been happening on many American college campuses for many years now. The faculty members at many of these top universities, in many cases, harbor extremist and also anti-Israel and sometimes anti-American sentiments. And in history courses, in political science courses, and spilling over into other fields like sociology, anthropology, law, etc., anti-Israel sentiment, extreme anti-Israel sentiment, is often voiced by faculty members, by the voices of authority in those classrooms. Well, if you teach large numbers of Columbia, Harvard, and Yale students for years and years and years that Israel is evil, that Zionism needs to be eradicated, that Israel has to be destroyed, that Hamas are freedom fighters, well, then eventually a certain number of those students are going to start marching through campus praising Hamas and calling for Israel's destruction and denouncing Zionism as evil and racist. So sadly, the core of the problem is not the cowardice of the university administrations, although that is a serious problem. They're kowtowing and appeasing the raging mobs is appalling. But really, the core of the problem is that a significant number of tenured radicals in these universities are teaching what amounts to hatred, and eventually, the young men and women whom they're teaching are going to voice that hatred, as we're seeing before our eyes every single day now.
And I think I'm glad you brought up faculty. I think that the other part of the equation is the lack of response on the part of college administrators. And this webinar is co-sponsored by Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, and I failed to say that at the beginning, but Asaf Romarowski and I wrote an article years ago that college administrators need to wake up and start doing something about the anti-Semitism that we saw a long time ago flourishing on their campuses. So now we're seeing administrators at, the president of Northwestern ceded to the demands of the protesters, as did the president of Brown. I mean, Northwestern is now promising to invite Palestinian students with scholarships to their campus. Do you, and then I think part of this is you talk about what these children have been learning, or these young adults have been learning, the DEI and critical race theory and all of that stuff that they're seeped in, oppressor versus oppressed, that needs to change. Do you have any thoughts on whether it actually will change? Are we seeing changes? Because DEI is so embedded in our campuses.
I'm not optimistic. I think the university world today is so filled with both extremist professors and timid administrators that the likelihood of a significant change, I think, is disappointingly small. Now, I want to add that it's not that the university administrators are necessarily cowardly every time they face problems with the student body. Imagine for a moment that the people who were setting up all these tents illegally on university property were white supremacists. Let's say the youth wing of the Ku Klux Klan or some Nazi group. And let's say their placards and slogans and speeches were calling for violence against African Americans. Does anybody believe for a minute that the president of Harvard or Yale or MIT or Penn would negotiate with these white supremacist bigots? Would they give in to their demands? Would they allow those tents and hateful slogans and calls for lynching to be on university property for a day, for an hour? No, certainly not. There's no doubt. Now, part of the reason, though, that they would respond differently to threats against other minority groups I think, is that many university administrators, like many others in American society, perceive American Jews differently than they perceive other minority groups. I think in many cases they would expect a forceful reaction from other groups that they are not seeing from American Jews. Um, there have been very few organized responses on college campuses by the pro-Israel forces. I'm not criticizing the students. I understand that Jewish students on these campuses feel they're frightened, they're intimidated. But it's surprising that many of our mainstream Jewish and Zionist organizations are not out there marching and actively countering the anti-Israel forces and responding, with something more than angry press releases. For university administrators, I think they perceive American Jews as patsies. American Jews might complain, but will they actually respond? Now, of course, some groups, including Emet, have responded more vigorously. A number of important lawsuits have been launched, and that's all very positive. But in terms of street action, in terms of what the university leadership is seeing on their campus, what they're seeing is one side yelling and threatening and screaming, and getting the university a lot of bad press. And the other side, the Jewish pro-Israel side, as generally as victims, as weak, as quiet, as just trying to get along. And that shapes the way the university responds. So when I say that they would respond vigorously to white supremacist students calling for the lynching of African Americans, it's because they know that the African American community and others opposed to racism would respond quickly and forcefully, and would not allow the university to tolerate such hatred. But unfortunately, American Jews, by and large, American Jewish organizations, by and large, have responded in a more passive way, and the takeaway from that, in the minds of many university administrators, is that they don't need to really appease the Jews. Now, what I think a lot of university leaders are going to be surprised to discover, though, in the months ahead, that if nothing else, many Jews are going to be voting with their feet, which is to say, many Jewish parents are not going to be sending their students sending their children to Columbia or Yale or Harvard in the years to come. I think we can anticipate a significant reduction in the number of young Jewish men and women whose parents are willing to pay $60 or $80 or $90,000 a year to an Ivy League institution only to see their children harassed, intimidated, afraid to attend a Friday night dinner at the campus Hillel. So in that sense, there probably will be a change, because the universities are not likely to take significant action against Students for Justice in Palestine and other anti-Jewish groups, probably what they're going to discover is that a lot of Jewish parents and their Jewish tuition dollars are going to go to universities that are perceived as more safe, including Jewish majority universities and Israeli universities.
So I'm glad you brought up Jewish leadership, because I want to spend some time talking about that a little bit more. You wrote a book, and I actually had you on a webinar, several quiet, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, and the Holocaust. I urge everybody to read the book. I learned a lot from reading it. But the book is called "The Jews Should Keep Quiet," which is what I believe FDR actually said, and pretty much what Jewish leadership was doing, lest they lose their access. Excuse me. Rabbi Wise had great access to FDR and the White House. Do you see the failure on the part of Jewish leadership to grasp what's transpiring today as something that's similar to that situation back then? I mean, I don't want to be accused of a Jewish lobby, and maybe that's part of their timidity. But I mean, I think that there's valid comparisons to Rabbi Wise in the 30s and 40s. Where are our Jewish leaders? I know a lot of us are saying, where is the Conference of Presidents and the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt? We hear him speak here and there, but they're not doing anything. Are they more worried about access to the White House Hanukkah party? And the other thing is, reading your book, Jews were not fully accepted in America at the time of the Holocaust. Today, they are. And I think that that's a significant difference, and they should be louder and they should be doing more. What are your thoughts on that?
So here's an interesting historical fact to consider. During the 1930s and 1940s, most American Jews were immigrants or the children of immigrants. They were not yet fully confident in their place in American society. They didn't feel as if they were fully accepted as Americans, and they were hesitant to speak out publicly on Jewish issues. Broadly speaking, there were, of course, exceptions, but this was the general trend, and that applies to the leaders of the Jewish and Zionist organizations as well. So, for example, during that entire period, during the Nazi era, there was only one march for the rescue of Europe's Jews in our nation's capital, in Washington, D.C., during all those years. And that was when about 500 Orthodox rabbis marched to the White House in 1943, only to be turned away by President Roosevelt. But things changed after the war, as we know, from the Soviet Jewry protest movement and the rise of organized pro-Israel activism. The next generation of American Jews tried very hard to learn from the mistakes of their parents' generation. Veterans of the Soviet Jewry protest movement, whom I have interviewed, have said to me that they were very conscious of the fact that American Jews did not rise to the challenge in the 1940s. And many of them knew about that march to the White House. And they were determined not to repeat those mistakes. And so the movement for Soviet Jewry included many marches to the White House, and it was a broad-based national protest movement by American Jews, whether they were from the political left, right, or center. It was a successful, activist, high-profile movement, which did not rely on the old ideas of backstairs diplomacy and quiet intercession that were more characteristic of previous generations of Jewish leaders. And the same is true for pro-Israel activism. Groups like AIPAC and today groups like Emet have responded to the threats to Israel in ways that American Jews did not respond in the 1940s, for example, and the 30s, when President Roosevelt's attitude towards Zionism, towards creating a Jewish state, was lukewarm at best and often very disappointing. And yet, American Jewish leaders like Rabbi Wise were afraid to challenge President Roosevelt. So, until recently, I would have said that by and large, this generation of American Jews recognizes the mistakes that were made when Jews kept quiet in previous decades. However, at the same time, the response of the major Jewish and Zionist organizations since October 7th has been surprisingly hesitant and disappointing in many ways. There was one very large and very important rally in Washington, but that was 5 or 6 months ago. Why haven't there been other rallies? The anti-Israel and anti-Semitic forces have been holding massive rallies all over the country. And yet, for some reason, our major Jewish and Zionist organizations, well-funded and with large staffs, can't seem to put together more protests like that. Just this week, we've heard confirmation that the Biden administration has been deliberately withholding munitions that Israel needs for its fight against the Hamas terrorists. You would have expected a very substantial and vigorous response from the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations. We haven't heard it yet. We may yet hear some statement, but when an unprecedented action like that takes place, when a U.S. president, an American president and administration take the extreme step of withholding badly needed weapons from Israel at a moment when Israel is fighting against those who want to annihilate it, when Iranian missiles were raining down, were fired at Israel just weeks ago. At a time like this, it's not enough just to be issuing an angry press release. You would expect these Jewish organizations, either together or separately, would be going to the White House and making their feelings known. So it is surprising that they're not doing that. And yet, at the end of the day, the question is, what kind of lessons will we learn? Today, we look back at the 1930s and 1940s, and we regret how hesitant American Jewish leaders were in those days. It's frightening to think that years from now we may look back at 2024 and ask the same kinds of questions. Why weren't they more outspoken? I hope in the days, weeks, and months ahead there will be a more vigorous response to the incredible pressure that is being put on Israel and the attempts to tie Israel's hands in the face of its most bloodthirsty enemies. That remains to be seen. As a historian, I know that often we can't see the full picture until years later when archives are opened and documents become available. But some of the picture is obvious because it's playing out in the headlines every day. So we are learning just by looking at each day's news about events that merit a more vigorous Jewish response. And we can only hope that those who presume to be leaders of Jewish organizations, I say presume because in almost no cases are they democratically elected, but those who claim to be spokesmen for the American Jewish organizations, whether on the political right or the center or the left, they have a responsibility. They have a responsibility first and foremost to represent, to articulate what the majority of the American Jewish community wants. I find it hard to believe that the majority of American Jews are satisfied with having only one rally in Washington every 6 months at a time of such extreme crisis for Israel.
I actually wrote an article after the rally, extremely critical of what transpired there. I think there was absolutely no message, and there was no messages to the White House or to Congress. Schumer promised to fund aid to Israel and proceeded to go back 5 minutes later on the floor of the Senate and voted no on aid to Israel at the time. There, I could go on, but I'm very disappointed in our leadership, and I think the rally was an opportunity that was a missed opportunity. But I'm glad you brought up the Biden administration and putting aside its Israel policy, because we're talking about anti-Semitism, and I could spend a long time criticizing this administration on its policy since October 7th. But do you see a parallel between the Biden administration's failure to forcefully denounce what's been going on as something similar to the way FDR was silent during the Holocaust? I don't believe that Biden has a personal animus towards the Jewish people, which you may say that FDR did. Excuse me, but it seems to me that an Oval Office speech would have been appropriate as our campuses and streets were blowing up. I mean, it's not just campuses, it's getting to work when the bridges and tunnels have been shut down, and trying to go through Grand Central Station when the trains have been shut down. Do you see a role for the federal government? Because I'm also frustrated with the Department of Education, which is now investigating Emory, Columbia, and a few other schools for anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian violations. And the Department of Justice is not being, the tools of the FBI are not being used to investigate all of what's going on today. Pulling federal funds of campuses would be a terrific starting place. So what are your thoughts on the Biden administration's handling of the campus anti-Semitism, the street anti-Semitism? Is that similar to, again, the apathy, I guess, of FDR to the Jew hatred we saw back in the 30s and 40s?
Well, let me address two aspects of this problem. One is the Biden administration's policy toward Israel, and the other is the question that you've raised of the administration's response to campus anti-Semitism. When we speak about U.S. policy toward Israel, I would look to a much more recent parallel, more recent than the 1940s. I think we should recall what happened in 1975 when Gerald Ford was president and Henry Kissinger was his Secretary of State. Ford and Kissinger wanted Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin to surrender a large part of the Sinai Peninsula, including strategic mountain passes and important oil fields that Israel depended on for its one of its chief energy sources. They wanted Rabin to surrender those to Egypt in exchange for something far less than peace. It was a non-belligerency agreement, as they called it, of a few years. And Prime Minister Rabin resisted. So let's just pause here and note, those who think that the problem in Israel is that it has a right of center prime minister in Benjamin Netanyahu, I'm speaking about how the US government treated a left of center Israeli prime minister, the Labor Party's Yitzhak Rabin, in 1975. Rabin and his cabinet, their government, at first resisted the pressure that Kissinger exercised in his famous shuttle diplomacy, going back and forth between Cairo and Jerusalem, again and again trying to pressure the Israelis to give in to these Egyptian demands. And when Rabin continued to resist, what Kissinger did is he announced a reassessment of American policy toward Israel. What President Ford and Secretary Kissinger had in mind was not merely a reassessment. That was camouflage. They continued to insist that they were friends of Israel and they're only looking out for Israel's best interests, exactly as President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken say today. In fact, behind the scenes, what they did is they suspended US arms shipments to Israel. Keep in mind that this was just over a year since the conclusion of the Yom Kippur War, when Israel was fighting for its very survival. And there was no way of knowing when war might erupt again, when the Arabs might attack again. And yet here was, Israel's declared ally, the United States, suspending arms shipments. During this episode, 1975, American Jewish leaders were afraid to publicly challenge Kissinger. Kissinger, by the way, cleverly used the fact that he's Jewish as a weapon. He would often say to Israeli negotiators and to journalists, I'm Jewish, so they can't say that I'm anti-Israel. American Jewish leaders at the time, the head of the Conference of Presidents of American Jewish Organizations, said that they were not aware of any pressure in Israel, and they were reassured by Kissinger's behind-the-scenes promises to them that nothing bad was really going on. But in fact, Ford and Kissinger were strangling Israel. They used the most brutal pressure they could on Rabin by cutting off arms shipments. And finally, at the end of that summer, 1975, Prime Minister Rabin and his cabinet collapsed. They surrendered. They gave in to Kissinger's demands. They surrendered those strategic mountain passes and the oil fields that Israel desperately needed. And by the way, part of the deal was that Kissinger guaranteed, I'm putting that in quotation marks, Kissinger guaranteed that the Shah of Iran would be providing Israel with the oil that it was giving up from those Sinai oil fields. It was only 4 years later that the Shah was overthrown. Ayatollah Khomeini took over in Iran, and Israel suddenly had to look for oil elsewhere. So those kinds of guarantees have always tended to prove very temporary at best. Well, now we stand at a somewhat similar historical moment where, once again, the President of the United States and his Secretary of State have suspended the shipments of some arms to Israel. In this case, right in the middle of a wartime. And we wait to see if the response of organized Jewish and Zionist leaders in America will be any more forceful than it was in 1975. Without strong American Jewish support in 75, Rabin felt he was unable to withstand US pressure. Had there been a substantial response by organized American Jewry in those days, things might have been very different. So time will tell. As for the Biden administration's response to campus anti-Semitism, I think it can be summed up in the phrase, too little, too late. The administration, the president, should have been speaking out much more forcefully, much earlier. The president should not be lumping anti-Semitism together with Islamophobia when he speaks about what's happening on the campuses. There are no marches on college campuses calling for the mass murder of Muslims or Arabs. There are no waves of anti-Muslim vandalism, threats, harassment. Muslim students on these campuses are not being targeted or intimidated, attacked. So for the president to lump them together as he did in his recent statement when he said he condemns anti-Semitism on campuses as well as Islamophobia and discrimination against Arabs and discrimination against Palestinians. So they got 3 out of the 4 categories. The Jews got 1. I mean, that really was trivializing the extent of the massive surge of anti-Semitism on America's campuses. There are a lot of things that the president and his administration could do if they wanted to intervene on the campuses, starting by speaking out. But of course, the federal government has many other powers at its disposal. If it was genuinely concerned about all of the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic hatred on the campuses, it could do a lot more. But there's a political problem, as we know. We are in an election year. The president's political advisors seem to believe that he could lose a lot of votes, especially among young Americans, if he appears to be too pro-Israel, or if he appears to be speaking out or taking action against the anti-Israel forces on campuses. But you know, there was a very interesting poll came out this week. We've all heard about the polls showing that a significant number of younger Americans are becoming hostile to Israel and are sympathetic to the Palestinian Arab cause more than they are to Israel. But there was also a poll that asked, how much do these young Americans even care about Gaza, Hamas, Israel? Where is it on their their list of priorities? And interestingly, only 2% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 regard the Gaza situation as their top concern. And overall, for most of them, it ranked around number 15 in their list of concerns. Most young Americans care about a lot of other things way before they care about Gaza. So sure, they have opinions, and their opinions are often based on misinformation and nonsense, but it's not a very important issue to them. And it's hard to believe that many of them would actually cast their votes on the basis of American policy towards Israel. So in a sense, President Biden's political advisors are running scared, but they're running from an illusion. They seem to think that there is a genuine political danger to the president if he says the right thing, if he actually speaks out forcefully against anti-Semitism or takes action to protect American Jews from those who are attacking them. But in reality, the political price that the president would pay is probably extremely small.
I think that, well, in 2022, there was a poll of American Jews, and Israel was basically at the bottom of their list of voting priorities. And perhaps there is a misunderstanding in the White House that, the opposite of what James Baker said, F the Jews, they're not going to vote for us. Well, F the Jews, they are going to vote for us anyway. So we'll see, I guess, in November whether events since October 7th have changed the priorities of Jewish voters as well. I do want to try to get to a couple questions. I know we're running out of time. And somebody, actually, I had some left of my own, and one of mine was about Holocaust education, and someone else is in the audience is asking about Holocaust education because it seems to be failing. And what are your thoughts on that? We polling indicates that a huge percentage of these young people believe that the Holocaust was a myth, or they're not sure. So what are your thoughts on that?
As a Holocaust educator, I think that Holocaust education is good and necessary. It's the right thing, but it would be, we'd be kidding ourselves if we thought that Holocaust education is the answer to anti-Semitism. So while on the one hand, it's vitally important that we learn, while on the one hand, it's vitally important that we learn about the Holocaust, and especially about how our own country, our own president, our own news media responded to the Holocaust. At the same time, let's keep in mind that there are a lot of other factors that shape how people feel about Jews. Factors aside from whether or not they feel sorry for the fact that the Jews were murdered in Europe 80 years ago. So it's not that Holocaust education has failed. It's that if we expect it to do more than it really can, then we're going to be disappointed. Now, there's a valid question as to how much, to what extent American Jewish monetary resources should be invested in Holocaust museums and Holocaust education. But there's no clear answer. there's no reason that that Holocaust and other subjects can't all be taught, both in the public schools and in our private Jewish schools. So I don't think we have to choose between one or the other. They're both important. But as we're seeing from today's events, it's not enough to say that, oh, look, the Jews were victimized and therefore the world should feel sorry for them. Unfortunately, the world, the international community, seems to have a very short memory. And the fact that Jews were victimized by Nazis long ago doesn't seem to impress many people today, least of all those who are marching on university campuses with signs calling for a final solution.
Yeah, Jonathan Tobin actually wrote a great piece in JNS a couple of days ago on this topic, and he argued that the education has to be more expansive. It has to include Jewish history and not just the Holocaust, as if that's when our history began. So someone is asking about the IRA definition and the pushback on the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that I referred to earlier on. And this verse and the pushback in the name of free speech. Can you just touch on how the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act might help protect Jewish students and why the pushback is not correct?
You can't fight anti-Semitism unless there's a clear, accepted definition of what anti-Semitism is. You can't fight it legally. You can't fight it in the court of public opinion. There has to be a widely understood, recognized definition of anti-Semitism. And there is. 33 countries belong to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which crafted the definition of anti-Semitism that the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act would codify. The reason there has been opposition is because the IHRA definition correctly states that comparing Israel to Nazi Germany, comparing Jews to Nazis, is an example of anti-Semitism. So people who are hostile to Israel don't want that to be part of the accepted definition, because it means then that they would not be able to go around comparing Israel to the Nazis without potential consequences. That's the reality. They say that they're the opponents of Israel, the opponents of this bill. They say that they're concerned about the IHRA definition is a question of free speech, but that's nonsense. That's just a cover. It doesn't endanger free speech. It doesn't contradict our Constitution and our guaranteed civil liberties. The problem is they don't want people to say, hey, you're using an anti-Semitic stereotype, because that's what's in the definition. They don't want to face that kind of criticism. So that's the reason that many from the anti-Israel or crowd, or the pro-Palestinian Arab crowd, are against this bill and against this definition. But that's really just a reminder of how badly it's needed, so that people from that camp can't go around using criticism of Israel, as they put it, as just a fig leaf for what in fact is an embrace of violent terrorists and of anti-Semitism.
So it's 1 o'clock, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get to the rest of the questions. I apologize to those of you who submitted one. Perhaps we can continue this conversation at some point in the future. Dr. Medoff, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate your insights always, and I urge everybody to follow his work. I wish everyone a good afternoon.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Bye-bye.